wondering if you could tell me a little bit about this exhibit that we have going on here, Blake's Outsiders.
Well, Blake's Outsiders, we got involved with the whole Blake thing because there's locally in Bognor, there's the cottage where Blake lived, where he actually wrote Jerusalem. And we got involved with the Big Blake project because they were trying to raise the money to buy the cottage to turn it into a centre of imagination where artists and writers could go and sort of have residencies and make work and stuff. So that's what started off. I mean, I've always been interested in Blake anyway, but that's sort of what started it off. And then, you know, learning more and more about him and realising much more that he was sort of an outsider in a sense in terms of his political views and everything else. And having been involved in the outsider art world, particularly through my husband Damien, also being aware of the biography of the artist and how that can be affected by other forces.
Yeah.
As in terms of like Blake is seen as quite an establishment figure now, in a sense. And I think many people actually don't really understand what his work or his poetry and things were completely about.
Yeah.
In one way. And obviously everyone's entitled to their own interpretation of what art is, but I think that very much so artists, particularly after they're dead, can get claimed by other people, and what other people think about them or write about them becomes the truth as such.
Yeah.
So it's also tied in with this idea of what is the truth with politics, for example, and the manipulation of that in a sense. So, you know, it's a group show, so it's quite a mixed group of artists.
Yeah, yeah.
Contemporary artists as well, so it's not all really outsider art. But it's also questioning, I suppose, what that is.
And that's so interesting, because I didn't tell you this, but I'm an English major, so when we study Blake, it's always sort of as this, you know, revered figure, and you don't hear about sort of the anti-establishment side. So that's really interesting what you're saying about sort of the absolute of the literary master, not so much his, you know, more opposing views. That's really cool, really cool.
So it's just a different take on it. It's like just trying to give things a different take, because obviously coming from the community I come from, I have to sort of deal with that all the time because of what people's expectations of what gypsies are.
Yeah.
So they have such an expectation, or they think they know so much about it or more about it than you do yourself, as one of the people that they're talking about. That it's been a constant ongoing debate and questioning, and also a lot of the work that I make is about this. So I suppose it bleeds into other things in other areas, and also affects many other people because of what people's preconceived ideas are from what they think they know from what they've read, for example.
Background and sort of, you're talking about like the gypsy influence that you have and how you got into the art world. That's kind of immense, but
yeah, it's quite. I mean, I come from a very sort of traditional family. I'm the eldest of 5 and I'm a girl, so for a start there's usually very little expectation that you'll do anything other than get married and have children, and I know that seems very stereotypical, but that is something that does happen. And so I don't shy away from some of the stuff that is seen as stereotypical, and also some of the stuff that actually is a reality as well, because I think that's for you to get a sort of nuanced overall view, you've got to look at all of it. You can't pretend that this doesn't happen, that doesn't happen either. So I'm also the only one of the 5 of us that finished secondary school, and the only one that went on to do any sort of further education. And so I was balancing this sort of art school life with a very traditional Romany, gypsy Romany life as well. So I did fashion and textiles. I didn't study fine art.
Okay.
Which gave me, I think, a different. I was always interested in how people looked, what they wore, particularly as I was growing up, because it was a very much particular way of dressing, and women would have their hair in particular ways, for example, and jewellery and everything. And that has changed quite dramatically in my own lifetime, so it's much more now, people are much more into designer labels and all of that sort of thing. So it's there are other things that people wear, or particular vehicles that people like to drive. There's other sort of markers, I would say, that still exist, but they're quite different now to what they were at another time. And because I did fashion, I am interested in how people, what they wear, how they wear it, where it's come from. The cultural appropriation of that, what does it mean? You know, like if it's come from one place and it has a real significance in terms of like maybe it's a piece of jewellery, or you know, body modification in the sense that would happen to a particular person at a particular time for a very important reason, how that then is brought into a different context, and what it means if you switch those things, or you start switching those things around, or you start playing around with them. The fashion thing has never really left me, and also the textile thing as well, because I still make a lot of installations that are purely made from textile stuff, so it makes them very easy to transport.
Okay.
So they can shrink down or they can expand in size as well.
Yeah.
It's something I like to work with. I'm also interested in fabrics as to what's on them. So very often the work is made out of vintage fabrics that have maybe strange nursery rhymes on them that have got like visually represented. So you might have a small child being chased with a guy with a sword or an axe or something, or bedding that children put to bedding. I'm very interested in like action man, for example, with all the foreigners and that is sort of depicted on those. Also the reinforcement of stereotypes. So I've often used a lot of Disney princess fabrics.
Oh, very interesting. And so do you think that your art uses a lot of sort of everyday objects? Is that
I mean, a lot of the stuff comes from charity shops, car boot sales. Some things I do buy, particularly the sort of Disney stuff that I've bought and I've done things with. I mean, that's also again about a sort of particular stereotype. You know, if you look at My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding, it's an idea that everyone has these amazing sort of like Disney princess type wedding dresses, which, you know, if you ask most 16 or 17-year-old girls, I'm sure they'd want a dress like that, because that is so sort of pushed in their face, that the whole marketing thing that goes with that. So I don't necessarily think even something like that is, you know, can be generalised to be one person's idea of what they would like also. And I think about also with using those, the fact that many of those things are made in appalling conditions by people who will never be able to afford those actual things themselves. So they're making items for children that they would not be able to afford for their own children, in a sense.
That's so interesting. I didn't even think about that side of it with fashion. So sort of like the humanity aspect of it and the ethicality behind all of that. That's really interesting.
Well, I think it's always at what cost.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think people actually think if you go into a shop and you're paying £2 for a t-shirt, for example.
Yeah.
What's the chain of events that lead it to be £2?
Yeah. So do you think that's so interesting? And do you think that art is sort of your way of addressing that problem, or do you sort of seek to have more ethical shopping practices? You know, how do you
well, I think in the work there's lots of different. I think it's quite multi-layered. So I'm talking about lots of different things. There's a lot of politics, a lot of ethical stuff. Very often when I'm creating installations, I have mannequins in them that aren't adult size; they're child size. So it's also this idea that. You can very much get stuck in the position you're in the country you're in, and not see outside of that. You can be very much in a bubble, and so you might think that every child has the same opportunities that your child has because of that, but that is not necessarily the case. So many children are sort of lost. You know, they don't have those opportunities, and a lot of the ability and potential that's there. It's just sort of never realised because they're not in a position to do that. Many children have to become adults at a very, very young age in order just to survive.
Yeah, and that's so interesting coming from an American perspective, because I think in a really minute way Study Abroad gave me that, just being able to see that my own perspective. I was sort of instilled from a young age that it was absolute, you know, the viewing of the other was just instilled in how everyone, I feel like, around me was raised. But just getting that, stepping outside was invaluable, and starting to view that not everyone can do everything. You know, growing up, you're told you can be anything you want, and you start to think, is that true? You know, what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's, I really struggle with this idea that it's possible for everybody to reach their full potential, particularly when so many people have such difficult circumstances conspiring against them. And when you live in a world where capitalism is viewed as the only way of doing things, there are many victims of that will not be able to do what they want to do. And I feel like we need to sort of readdress this. We need to relook at it and think, actually, you know, are certain people benefiting more and more at the cost of many others not being able to succeed?
Yeah.
So I think that it's just trying to see things in a different way, as opposed to, I think, you know, it's very difficult now, I think, looking at, you know, being in England and this whole, you know, coming out of the EU thing, for example.
Yeah.
That, you know, majorly has, you know, it's okay the government backtracking to a certain extent now, but, you know, they've tried to sell it on an immigration issue alone. And yet many people in this country would not realise that, you know, any protection in the workplace that they have is only there because of us being part of Europe. They wouldn't have that. So even though I have my problems with Europe at the moment, especially with the current refugee crisis, and it is a refugee crisis, so, you know, let's forget about immigration because it's not actually really about that.
Yeah.
It's about something else. And also it's this use of words as well. So again, we're back to that idea, you know, what does a word conjure up? And if you project a word in a particular way, then what does that do to how people think about that, or how they think about other human beings? Because they start to not see them as other human beings as well. That's what actually happens.
Yeah, the dehumanization is so prevalent, I think, and especially with the refugee crisis, like you were saying. And I wanted to ask you if you think sort of xenophobia as a whole is one of the biggest social issues facing Britain, or is that a global thing, or is it more?
I think it's a massive global problem that I've seen increasingly get worse.
Yeah.
I've been working in Europe predominantly since 2006, and, you know, one of the projects me and my husband did was Safe European Home with a question mark, which is the title's taken from a Clash record, which obviously the Clash record again, which is rock against racism and everything. But also because, you know, we could see there was an underclass, a general underclass developing, not only within the UK but within other European states as well. And coming from our community and working much more extensively with the different community, you know, because, you know, the politically correct term is Roma, but we're many different groups and we're scattered across the planet basically. But seeing that most of that has not changed for us, and we've been, you know, in different parts of Europe for 1,000 years now. And if people can't deal with that, how are they going to deal with anyone else? And you could, so subsequently as things have developed and there's been more, you know, I think people forget, you know, when there was the war in the former Yugoslavia, it was a war in Europe. It was a war. You know, what's happening in Syria is a war, you know, so people are refugees, they're trying to escape from that. You know, I'm really sorry, I have to disagree with people when, you know, like, you just don't get in a boat to go across the sea, risking your life and your children's lives in order to, you're not doing that just to claim a benefit. I'm really sorry, anyone who thinks that really should try and put themselves in that position. I think that's the other thing. I think people are very sort of quick to judge people when they actually think about what they would do under that set of circumstances. And many people have never spoken to someone who's come from Syria, so they won't know what's going on there. The same as people will, you know, they might have read or seen something on the news about what was happening in Yugoslavia, but they won't have probably ever met or had a conversation with someone who was actually there at that time, and then went somewhere else, and then subsequently has been deported to another country and has got no paper. So I think people aren't really aware also of the consequences of what happens over time with people from one place to another, from one city to another, from one country to another, and also what's sort of been happening in Europe generally over a period of time, and now this whole trade-off thing, like you take one person in but you send one person back and that sort of thing, you know, I mean, it's pretty, we're in a pretty strange, I think we're in strange times in some respects. And I think we haven't addressed things historically, and if you don't address that, it doesn't go away.
It's so, you know, you hear over and over again, history, you know, if you don't address it, history repeats itself, but it is so obvious when you talk about things like that. I think we kind of get blinded to it thinking, oh, we're being radically accepting in so many ways, and we're changing. We're not as homophobic as we used to be, and, you know, feminism is rising, but when you put it in those terms, it's so obvious that...
But also for who? Because if you actually look at the newspaper, you see, like, you know, there's been an increase in anti-Semitism
Oh, yeah.
And things like that. So it's not, so actually where is the acceptance? You know, and it's the same with feminism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what does feminism mean for many women who are sort of excluded from that conversation? Mm-hmm. And there are many that are excluded from it. Mm-hmm. So, you know, what can happen is you can get through the door, but you can close the door behind you and not allow the other people to come through.
Yeah.
Or not give them a key to be able to get through and follow you. Mm-hmm. And I think that you have to constantly be aware of that in these areas that people get involved in. I think you have to understand that there's always somebody else. And if you don't deal with those issues or you don't talk about it, it doesn't make it go away. And you might have made great steps forward, but you'll find yourself being dragged back. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, if it becomes acceptable for other groups to be demonised, then you will end up back joining those groups as well. So it's complicated, but I think we have to, you know, you have to constantly keep yourself in check and keep on top of it, really. And I think that it's very easy to get in a position and then think, oh well, I'm okay now.
Stop working.
So it doesn't matter about the others. Yeah. You know, I was one of the others, but now I'm sort of I'm in sort of mainstream, so it's fine. But you know, I think that can change, and it can happen really, really quickly. Yeah. I mean, genocide can happen like that. You know, it's not something that necessarily takes decades and decades to develop. It can happen very, very quickly. You know, at this moment in time, there will be some people somewhere who are improving their lives because they're the others, in inverted commas.
That's so interesting because I think that, you know, you can try really hard to fight that, but it's just, I feel like I always sort of spring back to that sort of judgmental viewpoint, even trying to be conscious of it. Do you feel a lot of guilt about that? Because obviously you're so aware of it. Do you feel like sort of trying to fight that tendency all the time? Or
it's just, I just find I just think it's really exhausting because you can't take it for granted that people know things. That's the other thing, you can't. I think it's very easy to be in a situation because you know, if I take my own community situation internationally, or even just from a European perspective, if you're involved in that debate, and you're part of that circle that's involved in that debate academically or in NGOs or whatever, you can end up having quite an insular way of looking at it. And then what you can end up doing as well is excluding. So you'll go on about being excluded and then you do exactly the same thing as well. Mm-hmm. So and also you can develop a conversation that actually in the real world starts to not have any sort of connection with that in a sense. As well.
Oh, okay.
So it can become about other things and it can become about doing things, but maybe not actually that are going to directly actually have an influence or an impact on the people you're actually supposed to be helping. Yeah. I think that's the other thing. So then it becomes about trying to change that dynamic in some way. Yeah. So for example, you know, we had Decade of Roma Inclusion from 2005 to 2015. Did it change anyone's perception of Roma or Gypsies? I don't think so. Yeah. Probably the perception's probably worse now than it was before it started. Yeah. And also, you know, the whole. So it's complicated, but I think you just have to keep looking at. You just have to keep looking at it. And you do have to keep thinking about it, and then approaching it in different ways. You know, because things are constantly in a state of flux as well. You know, things change. You know, I mean, the fact that everyone's got all this, you know, social media and access to all this material, but I don't know how deep that goes. So even though there's masses and masses of information and so many documents and so many books and things you can look at, but I don't know who's looking at that. Because I wonder how much it's just this surface thing, you know, is it just Snapchatting to your friend, or is it just Instagramming, you know, a selfie? Is it actually about trying to access the information that's available to give you a more nuanced view of the world?
And I feel like it's so hard to find truthful information because there's so much. I find this a lot just in the American political system because there's so much mudslinging and you don't know what, you know, the truth is. So it can be sort of debilitating to the point where like I don't want to even try. It's like how do you try? But I think there is it is a fad to give the appearance that you care about these things, sort of like share a link to donate here, do this, or being really active on a campus. And I've been guilty of this too, being really active, but not knowing a ton about the issue. So I think what you're saying is resonating with me a lot, because that is a big problem. It's almost the same thing. You're perpetuating it in a different way to be uneducated but active. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think it's quite hard, because people genuinely want to help someone else as well.
Yeah.
They genuinely want to help a cause, or they genuinely want to do this. But I think sometimes it can be, you have to look beyond what's going on and actually maybe just talk to the people who it's about, and what are their actual real needs at this moment in time. Yeah. As opposed to what's this sort of bigger picture that may be sort of masking a lot of things. I mean, with my community, we between us, we talk about the idea of the gypsy industry. That, there's many organisations now that get massive amounts of funding, and if the situation changes, then obviously they have no need to exist anymore. So then, what are they actually doing to change the situation? Because maybe it suits them to keep the situation as it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting.
So
that's
it's
scary.
And it is when you actually really start looking at it. It is scary, but it's also that's what it is as well. So it's it's sort of trying to sort of make work or get involved in things that maybe do question that and do rock the boat a little bit. I mean, it doesn't make you the most popular person, obviously. Yeah. It's not going to make you the most popular person. But, it's not about being popular. It's about maybe just trying to do the right thing sometimes. Yeah. And that's not about a popularity poll. Yeah. So that's just, but it's just one way of doing it or seeing it anyway.
Yeah.
So I don't know, it's up to the individual person how they want to approach it.
I have a question for you about what you're just saying about, it's not about being popular. How much do you think you need to sort of adapt to a system to convey your ideas, to reach people, without compromising your own ideas? You know what I mean?
I think there's different approaches to it. So, just having this visitor's book here is one example of that, because you'll actually get people sort of arguing with each other. They're not physically in the same space, but they sort of argue with each other within a book about what the work is or what it's about or whatever. So, and it's interesting because when you do an exhibition like this in a sort of, it's locally government funded building, then you also have to have a lot of information up for visitors. So everything, you can't just have a title list that people can, you do have to have titles and things on the work. You do have to have the information up there on the wall, and it has to be a particular size so people can see it and read it in a particular way. So it's giving that information. Now people can just walk around and they can just look at stuff if they want to. They've got the information there if they want to. There's a film, we've got a series of films, so we're changing the film every week, so there's a different film for people to watch. And I suppose the work, there's different types of work in here, so also what it is there's different accessible points for people. Some people will relate much more to, say, landscape painting than they would something like that dress hanging up there, for example, or a piece of text. So I think the other way is trying to access the artwork. But you can do this in different ways, and I don't think you have to compromise about what your work's about. I mean, this is it's a local Tory Conservative authority, but I've still got what have I got written on that? This is taken from a Blake book anyway. Yeah. But it's in her lifetime. Delaine's revolutionary ideas made her an outsider, a gypsy and an anarchist. She could hardly feel at home in Tory England, and that was what I just changed it to me. It was something that it's a quote from a book on Blake. Okay. So it hasn't stopped me putting that up. Yeah. For example. Yeah. And also there's lots of Union Jacks in here, but people could read that in a negative or in a positive way, depending on how you want to read that as a symbol. T-shirts, I mean, actually are, you know, they're quite patriotic or nationalistic in a way, and then I've changed what I've put on them, because obviously, you know, they've got St George on there, but you know, St George was a Palestinian. So it's also like people wave the St George flag, but do they actually know who St George was? Do they know the history of St George? Do they know the history of the Middle East, for example? I don't know. I don't know how many people really, when they're looking at a motif or an object, know the history of the different components about it. So also as well, maybe it's a case of using things that people think they know and then trying to subvert that in some way as well. So also you don't necessarily have to compromise in that way. I mean, initially when we started making artwork, we made our living in lots of different ways. So we weren't also relying on selling the artwork, in order to exhibit the artwork, if that makes sense. So that's also probably started us off in a different position where we sort of didn't have to compromise about what sort of artwork we were making as well.
Do you, because I know just on the little I know of your exhibition room, you had a very active part in that, even being a part of the work yourself. And I'm really interested to hear what you think, just in terms of the art world. How important do you think the hand of the artist is? Because in studying sort of conceptual art and how you can sort of come up with the idea and commission the work to a team, do you think that sort of cheapens the art in any way? Or is it all about the idea, or do you need to have a hand in it, do you think?
I think art is such a broad field to be working in, and artists choose different ways to make work. For me personally, having my own hand in the work is important, because sometimes something just happens in the process of making that leads on to something else or develops into something else. But for many other artists, the idea of the concept would lead to, once they've actually got the finished object, would lead them to something else. So I think it's, you know, I can only talk from my own viewpoint because I work in a very particular way. I think it's a personal thing. I think it's very difficult because there's always been a history as well of artists having other people help them make work or direct work, and other people have been the hands making it. So that's nothing new either. It's not a new thing that's happened in past decades or past century or whatever with the art, with the way work is made. But I feel some artists just feel like they have a different, it gives them a different way of maybe leading on to something by having their hands actually work. And I think everyone here makes the work themselves. So that would be you know, the work is made. I mean, Marcus collects things, so he goes out and collects all the bones and things for his work, but then obviously he constructs them together in a very particular way. There's a lot of painting in the show. Different forms of painting as well. You know, it's like saying that figurative and abstract art, you know, like...
it's a different, apples and oranges, I guess, when do you think you gained a sense of clarity that art was the way you wanted to address these issues that you were seeing? Did you always sort of know that, or was there a point where you thought, this is really where my inspiration is, my talents lie?
Well, I went to a local art school here actually in Worthing when it was actually still in the town, and then it moved to the outskirts of the town for my final year. And then I went to St Martin's, and I think maybe it was when I was at St Martin's, because when I was at Worthing it was like an old school art school, particularly when it was in the town, and you could go from one department to the other. If you wanted to do photography or printmaking or textiles, it didn't really matter. Everyone was quite welcoming, so you could just sort of manoeuvre yourself and make the type of work that you wanted to make, really, pretty self-indulgent. So it enabled you to do that. Obviously when I got to St Martin's there was a very clear defined line between who were the fashion students, who were the textile students, and obviously I was one of the textile students. It was, and it was when I got there, I think I sort of started to realise, because Damien was at Royal College, he'd already been at Royal College for a year at this point, and we'd got to meet lots of different people who were in other departments, who'd already sort of said to him that they thought he was like an outsider artist. Even though he's at Royal College of Art. And I suppose mixing with people that were in the sculpture department there, in the printmaking department and painting department, just gave us a different different view maybe of what it was we were making. Because a lot of the things I was making previously were embroidery or prints, but they were quite sort of one-off things really. They were just more like putting drawings on the screen and printing it and then embroidering and beadwork and sequin or whatever into that. So yeah, it's quite an interesting development, I suppose. And then when I left St Martin's, I did a lot of painting for a while, and then I started working more with fabrics and things. And then with Room, the idea when I did Room was I actually took the room that I worked in and just transplanted it into the gallery space. So that was when Transition was at Lauriston Road near Victoria Park. And it's a very different space to the space they have now, because it was an old garage, it was an old taxi garage. So it didn't have any windows or anything. You sort of there was like a little yard out the front, and you sort of came into it, and there was a bit like a little corridor, and you just came into this space. And I was in residence in there while the show was on, so I worked in the space, but it just ended up becoming like a conversation most of the time, because lots of people locally came into the space who hadn't actually been into the gallery before. And we just sort of chat and have cups of tea and stuff like that.
It's so interesting. That's so cool though. Just very interactive and
Well, it was interactive, but it was also interesting for me because the amount of people that came in there who were really seriously interested in art, theatre, literature, but felt like they couldn't visit galleries or they couldn't go to the theatre because they thought it was something that people like them weren't really allowed to do or didn't feel comfortable accessing. And I think that's still the same. I mean, if you go into a lot of galleries now, for example in London, you're not going to necessarily feel that welcome when you walk in there.
That's so true.
You know?
It is a little bit stuffy sometimes. You feel sort of like you need to look around, make sure, act like you know something about it. So I think there's a lot of people out there who are interested, but just don't feel like it's something there. And that's also what's interesting about doing an exhibition in a space like this as well, because it's actually, it's quite surprising how many people do visit exhibitions in local small spaces, local museums and art galleries and things as well, and are genuinely interested in seeing contemporary art that is also not what they would normally get to experience. I mean, that's generally mainly the feedback we've got, which I think is also really interesting, because a lot of people think, oh, you know, if you're just showing like of somewhere that's like a bit off the beaten track, you're not going to get that. But it's actually, I think there's a real sort of, people have a thirst for it, I think. It's a little bit less intimidating, would you say?
Well, I mean, people can come in here and they can sort of walk around at their own. There's obviously someone down on the desk and there's cameras and things in here, but people can sort of walk around at their own pace and do what they like, really. It's not like there's any sort of, there's no one sort of watching them as such. So they can sort of take as long or as little as they want, as time as they want to. And the information's also there for them. So there is the information for them to read, which means that they can sort of take in what they want from it, I suppose, in a sense.
I'm really interested, sort of lastly, about your definition of success, sort of in light of everything you've said, and talked sort of about how not everyone has the same amount of opportunities and how success can vary there. Do you sort of have a definition of success in your mind, or has that changed?
I mean, I had things that I wanted to do. So when I decided when I was at school, even though I didn't go to school that much, I wanted to go to art school. So I achieved that. And then when I was at art school, I knew that I wanted to go to London to go to, to continue it. So that's why I did my Masters at St Martin's. But success to me has many different facets to it. And I think the difficulty we have, particularly at this moment in time, is that for many people success is just about money. So if you haven't got money and you haven't got, a particular sort of house or drive a particular sort of car or dress in a particular way, for example, then you're not seen as being successful. And I think there are many different ways of being a successful human being. And it's not just about having lots of money. But I think we have to seriously look at that a bit more and think how do we sort of stop people thinking that's all you can do, or the whole celebrity culture thing where everyone wants to be famous for X amount of time, or everyone thinking that they can be on like Pop Idol or something, or Britain's Got Talent. And it's also going to answer all their prayers as well, because I think that unless you're comfortable with yourself, and I think that's sort of quite a difficult thing to quantify, but I think unless you're comfortable with yourself, you could be very successful in financial terms and with everything else that might go with that in terms of fame and all of that sort of thing. But actually you could still be pretty lonely and pretty miserable.
Yeah.
So I think it's just having a different, different ideas of what success can possibly be. And I think there are many things it can be, not just these particular things.
Yeah.
So I think that would be a better, and so I suppose that's just something that maybe I've sort of I know we need X amount of money.
Yeah. Yeah.
For example, to live on. That's like everyone needs so much money to get, particularly now it seems that everything is so expensive for everybody. But above and beyond that, you know, what else do you really need?
Yeah.
If you've got a roof over your head and you've got food to eat, then you're pretty lucky.
Yeah.
Because many people on the planet haven't got even that. So I also think it's seeing it in relative to where you are is also important, because for a lot of people, you know, they're in a society where there is an expectation that success means those particular things. And I feel many people are under a lot of pressure, maybe, and they're not actually as happy as they think they are because of being under that amount of pressure.
Yeah.
So all the things that are maybe spending more time with each other or more time with their children or whatever, that's the price they pay for this success.
Yeah.
So I think it's a massive question.
Yeah.
And it means something different to every person you talk to, really. So my idea about it is probably quite different.
So what's next for you? What's in the works?
We go to Vienna to do something about universal hospitality, which Kant wrote in, 1795. Which is, I've been looking at that text and it's interesting to see how that has such a resonance now in terms of like not treating other people equally, and that actually, you know, we all have an entitlement to the whole planet in a sense. You know, it's not like it shouldn't just belong to, like, say 10 companies and you know, the 20 richest people in the world. So we're going to be working on creating an installation for that. Damien's going to be working on some maps for that, and then we've got some other projects coming up, performance work and things that I do. In different places really. So it just, you know, and we're working locally. We work with Train of Thought Gallery, which is just around the corner from here, who we did the original Blake's outside as well.
Oh, okay.
And so there'll be a closing event for this, which will happen there. And we're working with quite a lot of artists locally as well now.
Okay.
Which, you know, we were sort of dipping in and out more initially, but we've got quite a lot of artists that we're working with. So so it's there's quite a lot happening, but it's quite mad, really.
Yeah, it sounds like it. But thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and your thoughts on sort of empathy and just acceptance. That's really inspiring to hear. So thank you so much for sharing that and talking about your work, and really appreciate it.
Taking the time out to come down and see
my pleasure. My pleasure.